All right. Welcome, everyone, to this DCI workshop. My name is Thibaut Schrepel. I am one of the co-founders of DCI. I am joined by friends and fantastic scholars today. More on their profile in just a minute. What I want to say before we start is that the Dynamic Competition Initiative is, as the name indicates, focusing on understanding dynamic competition and providing a framework to better capture the reality of those markets. Our working hypothesis is that innovation drives competition as much as competition drives innovation, at least in certain specific markets. And to test that hypothesis, we suggested to some of our young scholars to conduct a literature review documenting the interplay between innovation and competition in order to allow us to indeed build on the past studies and identify the gaps in the literature so that we can do something out of it. On that note, I'll just pass the floor to Nico, and then I'll come back to you with the schedule for today's session.
Thank you, Thibaut, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and be given the opportunity to explain a little bit why we are doing this today. So I think we can situate this discussion in the field of antitrust and competition policy. And I think it's fair to say that the knowledge environment around us on the relationship between competition and innovation is fairly hard to understand and decrypt. The anecdotal evidence around us shows a lot of puzzling mysteries around the relationship between innovation and competition. The traditional theories, Schumpeter and Arrow, about the necessity of large firms or the unnecessity of large firms to produce innovation in the economy appears extremely difficult to understand in the context of rising oligopolization and monopolization in industries which are extremely innovation intensive. At the same time, we see a lot of small firms create new products and services. So it's very hard to understand what's going on around us. The academic literature is not very easy to read. Ken Arrow himself was supposed to be the champion of the idea that competition brings innovation, wrote in a footnote that no one read that large firms were probably necessary to have innovation in the economy. The field of economics that we like to go to when we lawyers in antitrust and competition policy struggle to understand the empirical reality, the field of economics studies a direction of causation that treats competition as an input to innovation. But it studies less the other direction of causation, in which innovation can be an input to competition. And it doesn't really also tell us a lot about innovation itself being the output of something else. Managerial activity, or venture capital, or corporate capital, or equity funding. So our knowledge from industrial organization, the theories that we use in antitrust economics, is fairly limited because industrial organization studies industry structure. At the same time, the literature elsewhere in other fields is very scattered. We have a lot of works in business and management science that thrives with concepts and buzzwords, but it's very hard to know if these buzzwords have a form of vertebrate predictability or are invertebrate and empty concepts. In policymaking, for just a minute, we also struggle a lot. We have a good handle on the idea that more competition in products and services will bring about improvements in productive efficiency, but we really struggle when we start to think that competition and innovation can produce movements of the supply curve and push the production productivity frontier. So we know fairly well how to look at improvements on the supply curve, but we have a problem with thinking about market creation leading to new products and services being themselves sources of competition, movements of the supply curve. So because we struggle with all these things, Thibaut, myself, and Bo Hayden, the directors of the DCI, we've decided to task a few people with the mission to enlighten us today by going through the literature. We've also invited Fred Jenny, who's a chairman of the Competition Committee at the OECD, which will have very large events in a few days on innovation and competition in Paris to introduce the preliminary insights of that event and tell us more about what the purpose of the exercise is. Thibault, I hand over to you immediately.
Sure. Yeah, again, so just to be clear, so the OECD has this roundtable coming up on the 4th of December. They have also published already 2 highly interesting background papers that you can find on the OECD website, right? We'll put the link in the chat, but if you're watching this video in 2034 on YouTube or another decentralized alternative, feel free to go on the OECD website and get those 2 background papers. But in any case, Frederic very luckily will say a word about those 2 background papers in just a minute. For now, I just want to make it clear that we have indeed quite a schedule for you today. After Frederic, you will hear from Pankodi, who documented the empirical evidence on the relationship between the size of the firm and innovation. After which you will hear from Jennifer, who will present her findings when it comes to the empirical evidence dealing with the relationship between market structure and innovation. And after that, you will hear from Alexandra and Philip, who will take us through the literature review they've done, exploring how innovation drives competition. After all that, Nico and I will try to sum up their findings, meaning try to give a sense of what competition agencies and researchers can do in the space, and indeed what might be the next coming steps. We will come back to all of the speakers, talk about the agenda, the gaps that we see, and what we at the DCI we indeed intend to do in the coming future. And we have 20 minutes for the Q&A. I'll come back to you when it's time for the Q&A, but I can tell you already that we are most interested in hearing from you about the relevant studies that you will know of that we didn't identify, to hear about your experience in the space, the studies you've conducted, and so on and so forth. On that good note, Frederic, thank you so very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Not at all. Thank you very much for your invitation. I will be relatively brief, but let me first give you a little bit of context on what we're doing at OECD, because the roundtable that we're going to have next week is the second of a set of 2 roundtables. We first had in June of 2023 a roundtable where we invited experts, economics professors mostly, but not exclusively, to come and talk to us about the relationship between competition and innovation. And the reason for engaging in those 2 steps, I mean, those 2 roundtables, the first one which I talked about and the one which I will talk about, is the fact that there was a certain level of insatisfaction, I would say, among competition authorities on how they could handle the question of innovation. This question is coming up more and more in competition law enforcement because more than in the past, there are cases where it seems to make sense to think about innovation as a crucial element of how the market functions. But I must say that the enlightenment that we got from the first roundtable of the theoreticians was a little bit dimmed by the fact that, as Nicolas has mentioned, there are different schools of thoughts, and that those schools of thoughts do not give us a clear path to try to tackle those issues in enforcement cases. Okay, so the first element is the fact that economic theory is rather vague about the relationship between competition and innovation. We've heard that there are different dimensions or different ways to look at this relationship, which are somewhat contradictory. And there's not, empirical evidence has not been so far so crucial that it could tell us whether there is a unique relationship between those two. Now, this, of course, makes the life of competition authorities quite difficult. And for a long time, competition authorities have, at least since the middle of the 1990s, been interested in the issue of competition and innovation, at least sporadically. So they have tried to the best that they could to tackle this problem, but they are somewhat unsatisfied with the result. So the second roundtable is a roundtable among competition authority to try to say, well, what did we learn from the first roundtable? And let's look at our practice. Is there anything? What are the issues? How could it be improved? This is not going to lead directly to the definition of best practices, but ultimately, I mean, this is something that we at OECD will always have in mind. Okay, so now to do that, we gather a couple of elements. One of them is a background paper that Thibault just referred to, which was written by Aura Garcia-Pabon, which is excellent, I think, on what competition authorities actually do, why they do what they do, and what perspective one can have on what they do. And the second is that we're going to hear to a large number of contributions. We've got about 15 contributions in all from various countries, talking about their own practice and why they look at the problem the way they do. Now, I'm not going to talk so much about the contributions of the countries, first because they have not presented them orally, but I'm more going to focus on a number of issues which come out of the background paper by Aura Garcia-Pabon. The first point that comes out is that there are different approaches taken by competition authorities, different analytical perspective when it comes to competition and innovation. And it's not always very clear why one is chosen over another one. Okay. So what are those perspectives? Well, there are roughly three perspectives which are identified in the paper. One of them is what I would call the incentive-based kind of analysis, where really the question is whether, I mean, a lot of this has been related to mergers, because that is where most of the cases, not all of them, but most of the cases that deal with the relationship between competition and innovation are in the field of merger control. So I'm mostly going to talk about merger control, but there are a few cases about abuse of dominance, for example, which also raise those questions. So the incentive approach is basically the traditional approach, based on the fact that the crucial element is that competition drives innovation. And in this perspective, when you have a merger, the question is whether this merger is likely to reduce the incentive of the firms to engage into innovations. Now, there are different ways in which it could happen. One of the ways would be through unilateral theories of harm. But it's quite interesting to see what they say. The idea there is that, okay, you have two competing firms that are engaged in different types of research and development, leading to possibly different types of innovation. And if they merge, they will have an incentive to merge, so to speak, the two strands, or at least not to duplicate them. So there's going to be a smaller variety of research and development, and this is likely to decrease the amount of innovation that's going to come out. The second possibility is that the merger will foreclose the possibility of innovation by third parties by getting access to some kind of intellectual property, for example, which is strictly necessary to develop innovation. So those are the two very gross theories of harm which are used. Okay, when one looks at this, first of all, there are some challenges of this approach, but as we are going to see, all approaches have challenges. One of them is, of course, that you cannot really apply this in sectors which are high innovation sectors, because you start from a static definition of the market, where you look at the market shares of the firms that merge, and then you ask yourself whether this merger, given the market shares of the firm, is likely to reduce innovation, but somehow you keep the definition of the market, the relevant market, constant. Okay, so you do not internalize the fact that the market is going to develop and change as innovation comes in. So there is a little bit of inconsistency somewhere, because you assume that there is innovation, or there can be innovation, and yet you don't take it into consideration part of your analysis. And there's, of course, one difficulty, which we are going to find in all the cases, which is to assess what future competition is going to be like. So in those theories of harm, you just assume that future competition is going to be like today's competition. And I guess this negates a little bit, or denies the idea that there's going to be innovation. And there are some particular problems in assessing unilateral effects. Now, what I would say about this is that, first of all, when I first came across this, which is, I would say, the dominant way in which competition authorities deal with the issue, I was quite amazed at the fact that there is no concept of the economics of innovation in there. Because, first of all, we're not talking about innovation, we're talking about research and development projects. And we entirely base our reasoning on the fact that if there are fewer of them, then there will be fewer innovations. We don't ask ourselves, for example, whether the productivity of research and development may be increased if you join up two sets of research, which may be complementary. So it's purely quantitative, no concept of quality of innovation, and it's addresses the wrong variables. I mean, if you ask me, because it looks at the R&D, at the number of R&D projects, of competing R&D projects, rather than looking at what drives really innovation. But in any case, so this is a theory of an approach which is based on the static analysis. It decides that it's going to look at one dimension, which is going to be the impact on innovation, but it's still static in the sense that it does not integrate the changes to the market from the innovation, and it's absolutely focused on incentives. Those approaches usually don't talk practically about capabilities, or because they take a mechanistic kind of view of innovation. Okay, so that's the, and this is, by the way, one of the reasons why we wanted to look at those, because we thought that this was a very naive approach. So now the good news that you will see in the paper is that there is a second approach, which is more recent, by the way, which in the paper is called the impact-based approach to innovation, and where competition authorities take a more dynamic view of competition and innovation relationship. And really the starting point is the inverse of the previous one. The starting point is that innovation drives competition. So therefore, when I have a transaction, I want to look what it does to innovation, because that is going to tell me something about what it will do to competition. So rather than being in the traditional perspective where competition drives innovation, this second perspective is much more aligned with the idea that competition, that innovation is a very important part of the competitive mechanism. Okay, so this leads, of course, to a change in the market perspective. You don't start from a product market as you did in the traditional approach that I've outlined previously, but you start from an innovation market, for example, which was first talked about in the mid 1990s with the work of Gilbert, among others, and these markets or these innovation markets may be very precise, because you can identify in some cases a product which everybody is working on and which may possibly come out of the innovation, even though today it is in development and does not exist yet. So you're looking at what this market, once the innovation will have taken place, will look like. Or sometimes it's impossible to predict what are the specific products that are going to come about. And you look at what in the Dow-DuPont decision, for example, of the EU is called an investment, what is it called? It's not a path, but it's a much more general term, a line of development. And you try to figure out what are going to be the risks that those firms that are in the same domain of research and development might eventually have a decrease in their competition because of the merger in the future. So we've seen more and more of those cases, and certainly in Europe, the Dow-DuPont and the Bayer-Monsanto cases are clear cases where there's a change in perspective compared to previously. The theories of harm are more specific to innovation in this case. In the previous case, the theories of harm were the same as the traditional theories of harm. But here, there's a focus on two things. Is the merger going or likely to disincentivize, lower the incentive of firms to do research and development, because they will have, if they merge, they will realize that they are engaged in the same type of research and development, and therefore they will either enjoy their market power and refuse to innovate, or at least limit their research and development. So is the incentive to the parties to innovate going to go down? And is it likely there is going to be a delay or redirection of R&D activities to try to avoid duplication? Now, in those cases, what is interesting, and this is particularly true, for example, in the Dow-DuPont case, because this was the first one, at least in Europe from that point of view, you want to ask yourself whether the firms that merge are the only ones that have the capability of innovating, or whether after the merger there will be other firms that will have both the incentive and the capability to compete with them on innovation. Okay, so you do have to look at capacities as well. And this is a complete change of perspective compared to the previous approach, because you try to make a judgment on who is going to be best placed to try to innovate, whether the merging parties are, or whether it is some of the competing firms. Okay. What are the challenges there? Well, the challenge there is one of them, which is a little bit the same one, but it's worse, I would say, is the fact that you look at long-term, particularly when you have undefined research and development. In other words, you don't have a specific product in mind, but you have lines of research. You don't know what you're going to come up with. You don't know when it's going to come up to a possible competition. And therefore, you take a very long-term perspective. Now, taking a long-term perspective of what innovation could lead to in terms of competition is fairly fragile as a reasoning, because we don't have a very good theory of competition and innovation. Okay. So this creates a problem for the competition authority to anticipate what's going to happen, but it does create a second problem, which is the legal test in the case of merger control applicable to competition and innovation? Or do we have to have a relevant product which is well-defined and on which we judge? And second, can the speculation over time be robust enough that it will satisfy the courts that there is enough likelihood that this is going to happen so that the test is satisfied? The third approach, and the last approach, is the inverse relationship, the case where there is a restriction of competition, and if innovation is used as an efficiency benefit that accompany this restriction in competition, and where therefore you have to balance the restriction to competition and the possible benefit in terms of innovation. And so this is an efficiency defense, basically, and we know what the questions are, whether there are going to be efficiencies, are they directly related and uniquely related to the transaction, are they indispensable to get the innovation, and whether consumer welfare will be improved thanks to those. So this is not innovative. I mean, this is part of the traditional analysis. Sometimes the restriction to competition is justified by the development of innovation. There are only a few cases where the firms argue we need to restrict competition in order to be able to innovate. You can think about automobile batteries and things like this, where clearly this logic is there. Okay, so this is where we are. So we have different approaches. The very good news is that there is a second set of the impact-based approach, which I mentioned, because that's an approach which is the closest to the idea that innovation drives competition. But there are a number of challenges. The first challenge is we don't know what innovation really is. And we certainly don't look at innovation. We look at R&D spending, which is an input maybe in the process, but certainly not necessarily representative or linearly related to the output. The second question, is the fact that we don't have a good economic theory linking the two together. So we're a little bit in the dark when it comes to. The third one is that the more we look at innovation, the longer is the term that we have to have in mind. And the longer is the term, the more uncertain is the analysis. And the question is whether from a legal point of view, that's acceptable. So some authors suggest that one of the reasons why even in decisions where there is an impact-based approach, an approach where innovation drives competition, there are usually small remnant of the traditional approach, the incentive approach, just because the competition authorities are not sure that the judges are going to buy the long-term uncertainty of their prediction when it comes to innovation and competition. So there may be, besides the fact that there's insufficient empirical and theoretical relationship, there may be also a question of the legal test of mergers. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So the good news is that if you came to this seminar looking for new research topics or new arguments to put forward before agencies or courts, Frederic already delivered. So I feel now reassured that we delivered something to you. What I want to share is that knowing how big and important the week ahead of Frederic is, unfortunately, will have to leave us in about 30 minutes from now, which means that he won't be here during the Q&A. So what I suggest you do is that if you have questions specifically for Frederic, you can actually enter those questions using the Q&A function right now, and Frederic will answer those questions if possible within the next 30 minutes, or we'll make sure to send those questions to Frederic if you came up with questions in the next 90 minutes. On that good note, I will now pass the floor to Pankhudi, who once again documented the empirical evidence that we have, or that the literature actually explored, between the relationship between the firm size and innovation. And she's going to take us through what economic literature indeed came up with in the next 40 to 50 years. I'm not too sure actually how old is the oldest paper that you have identified, but in any case, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Thibault. So I will be looking at the relationship between firm size and innovation, and of course, the starting point is Schumpeter's hypothesis that the larger firms spend more on innovation than smaller firms. So what I will do is first I will come to my main finding, which is what I understood after looking at all the empirical studies. Then I go to my methodology of how I conducted this research. Then I will shift to the substance of the research that I found and how I think the literature has evolved. So I have looked from around 1980s. Of course, there are empirical studies before that as well. But from the most cited ones around 1980s till recent 2023. So I have divided that into 3 phases. So starting from 1990s to 2005, and then from 2005 to 2020, and then from 2020 till present, which are the most recent ones. And then I would give away my conclusion. So the main finding that I've found after looking at all the empirical studies is that there is no consensus on this relationship. There are studies which say that there is a positive relationship between firm size and innovation because of the obvious size advantages. But there are also studies which prove that this relationship is complex, and sometimes innovation by firms can depend upon other factors, such as the demand that the firm receives, or the industrial characteristics, the type of the market that the firm is functioning in, the technological competence, etc. And then there are studies which deny the existence of this relationship. So how I went around with these studies is I conducted a systematic literature review of the relevant journals which publish these empirical studies in this field, such as Research Policy, NBR Working Papers, Journal of Open Innovation, economics journals such as Journal of Law and Economics, etc. And I looked for highly cited journals in databases such as SSR and Hein Online, JSTOR, etc. And after finding these articles, I also did a bit of a citation analysis just to understand which are the works that are cited more and how are the future empirical studies sort of looking at the empirical studies or empirical evidence that we already have when we look at the relationship between firm size and innovation. So to look at how the literature has evolved, so the early literature, which I said is from 1980s to 2005, is various scholars that have studied the relationship between firm size and innovation had earlier confirmed that there is a positive relationship, but then came in shorts in their study in 1982 were one of the earliest works which refuted the Schumpeterian hypothesis. Their study found that except a few sectors, such as the chemical sector, the hypothesis of a positive effect of firm size, either on R&D effort or on innovation, is not supported. Then there were researchers like Cohen and Scherer who found that large firms are more process R&D oriented than small firms. So they said that large firms concentrate more on decreasing their costs, and therefore most of their innovations are more incremental innovation than radical innovation. So this sort of relates to the quantity of innovation rather than the quality of innovation. And also this is something that is now cited a lot, as we will see in the most recent studies. There are studies that also found that positive linkages between size and innovation occur only when there are certain conditions which are met. So for instance, in industries where there are high sunk costs or where there's economies of scale and scope. And so therefore the relationship does not exist in all the industries. Then in 2005, Bound basically came up with this idea that there's a U-type relationship between competition and innovation, that is small and large firms innovate more than the moderate-sized firms. So the idea behind Bound's study was basically that the small firms are innovating because they want to enter the market, and the large firms are innovating because they want to remain in the market, but the moderate-sized firms are not innovating as much. So and then there were a lot of studies in this period that talk about technological opportunity. Of course, this is the time when technology is developing rapidly. And so some studies find that firm size can have an indirect effect on R&D because it can base the firm's ability to access this technology or access the technological competence in form of workforce or in form of employing people who are good at technical expertise. So this was the earlier phase where we sort of look at the relationship between the firm size and innovation, and there's still no conclusiveness as to whether there is a positive relation. Then around 2010, Exeget basically through his study found that R&D spending increases less than proportional with firm size. So what he did was he used patent citations as a proxy for innovation quality. And then he looked at it and said that the firm size, as rapidly as the firm size increases, the innovation quality does not increase. And in certain instances, it is negatively, the firm size is negatively related to innovation quality. So most of these studies in this era agree that the relationship between firm size and innovation is complex. And in this time, there are more industry-specific empirical studies. So for instance, in a study conducted for French manufacturing sector, Philippe Aguillon and others found that demand conditions faced by a firm impact its innovation decision. So he says that based on the demand faced by a firm, the firm would then decide to innovate, and sometimes a demand shock basically encourages the firm to cite more patents. So there are also studies relating to service sector and knowledge-intensive industries where they find that a size disadvantage does not have severe impacts in such industries, because here in service sector and knowledge-intensive industries, even both small and micro firms are engaging with similar innovation activities and with similar ability as large firms. So this is again sort of concludes that there is no consensus, and it depends a lot on the industrial characteristics. It depends a lot on other factors, whether there could be a relationship between firm size and innovation. Then lastly, coming on to the most recent studies, Matt Clancy basically studied that there is an exponential decrease in the number of patents per R&D dollar as one moves up the size of the firm. So basically what he concludes is that as, again, the same conclusion that when the firms are increasing in size, they're not necessarily increasing their innovation. And he looks at, again, the patents, and he comes to the conclusion that at least 62% patents are not leading to product introductions. So what market leaders are doing is basically patenting but not commercializing their ideas. So he states that there are two reasons for this. First is cost spreading, and another being the replacement effect. That is, if a better version of a product is invented, people will buy the better version, and basically then the large firm would just be competing with itself. Exeget and Kerr also found that large firms are more likely to cite their own patents, which means that they are doing the discoveries or the innovation that they're doing is basically closer to what they've already explored. So again, as I said, that what Scherer found through his study, that large firms are mainly doing incremental innovation rather than focusing or improving their existing products rather than creating new ones. Then similarly, in a study which dealt with employment of US inventors, Exeget and Goldsklag find that large firms pay their inventors better. So they have the ability to acquire a better workforce, but they ask them to work on projects which are less likely to lead to new patents and products. And lastly, in the most recent study in 2023, Arora and Cohen and others have found that large firm advantage is not due to superior inventive capability, but due to the superior ability to extract value. So they say that because of greater commercialization capabilities, large firms are able to get more value for their invention, but that does not mean that their invention is of a better quality. So they say that while average invention value increases with size, average invention quality declines with size, suggesting that large firms benefit mainly from an appropriability advantage. And they basically deny that there's any relationship between firm size and innovation. So again, coming on to whether there is a positive relationship between firm size and innovation, as I said, that there's no consensus. And there have been many empirical studies regarding this relationship, but there's no study which conclusively states that there is no, or which conclusively refutes the existence of this relationship. But there are also not studies which conclusively say that it is directly proportional. So coming on to my conclusion of whether do large firms innovate more. So I think just being a large firm is not a sufficient guarantee that there would be incentives to innovate. As even Frederic said, that when we look at incentives to innovate, this could vary as per other factors. It could vary as per the type of market. And even if the large firm is innovating, sometimes what they're doing is just improving their existing products rather than creating new ones. And this is something which I think can be related to digital markets as well, where big firms' capabilities to create demand for the product becomes more important rather than innovation. So when we talk about innovation, we should focus more, as Frederic said, on the quality of innovation than the quantity of innovation. So whether the innovation that we're looking at or the product that has come is disruptive or a new product, rather than whether it's just an improved version of an existing one. And I think this parameter is now being studied in more recent empirical studies. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I think especially the studies you mentioned when it comes to R&D not leading necessarily to patent, or at least the fact that you do not see a linear relationship between the two, nicely complements what Frederic was telling us when it comes to the court addressing R&D as a way to address innovation, which is not exactly the same. There are 4 things I want to tell you before we move on to the next speaker. Number 1, Frederic will be with us till the end of this workshop. So my bad. And Marcos, we've received your question already. It will be addressed. So just to be sure, keep calm and keep on writing those questions in the chat. We have all the time we need. Number 2, the literature review that Pankhudi mentioned and that the other speakers will mention have not been published yet, because we want also to hear from you, the participants, and hopefully nicely complement what we have already, but this will be published. So you will get all the references on DCI website, which of course is a nice way for me to say, please register to our newsletter if you want to access and make sure to see that literature review. Number 3, Pankhudi, Philip, Alexandra, and Jennifer have something in common. And it is that they are all young scholars within the Dynamic Competition Initiative, which leads me to number 4. I like to give speakers short introductions, but no introduction is not acceptable. So apologize for that. So I do that very briefly. We've done that before going live, actually. So I just presumed that this was clear to everyone, but obviously it is not. So Pankhudi is a PhD candidate at the EUI, working on the interplay between innovation and competition, like all the others. Philip is also a PhD candidate at the EUI. Jennifer is a PhD candidate at St. Gallen University. And Alexandra is a PhD candidate at Aalborg University Business School. And she's also affiliated with a university in China. She will tell you more about that because she is right now in China, which may mean that anytime we may lose Alexandra because she is using a VPN to join us today. All right. On that, apologize once again for not giving an introduction. And I suggest we move on to Jennifer, who will present her findings when it comes to the empirical evidence dealing with the relationship between market structure and innovation. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good day from my side. First of all, I'm very happy to delve into the topic of the relationship between a market structure and innovation. As probably all of you already know, since Schumpeter brought up his proposition that monopolists actually create more innovation, this is a research topic that has gathered great interest. Maybe just as a quick recap for those who are not super familiar with the argument. So his argument is basically centered on the idea that increased competition diminishes profits and potential benefits tied to future innovations, making a monopolist more motivated to create innovations. other than firms that are in competitive markets. Of course, this proposition has led to a lovely set of literature, which one have theoretic models that actually agree with Schumpeter, but also a lot of people disagree with him and say, no, actually, we need competitive markets or markets with low concentration to create innovative output. Now, what do we do when we don't know what to do with all these theoretic models? We look at the empirical evidence, and this is what I will be trying to show to you in the next 10 minutes. So I will be trying to give you an overview of the different kind of empirical researches that exist on the relationship between market structure and innovation. Before I do that, however, I would like to just quickly elaborate how I conducted my literature research. So first of all, it also is based on a literature research that already exists. So I would highly recommend reading Gilbert, Looking for Mr. Schumpeter. It gives a very nice account till up 2006. And it also criticizes certain things that go wrong sometimes with empirical researches. For newer journals and also for other journals that might have been missed in that review, I did the same like Pankudi. I checked all the relevant journals, also all the relevant databases, and basically Googled for market structure and innovation, but also checked for stuff that would be a proxy for market structure innovation, for example, such as R&D expenditure. All right, so let's dive into my key findings. I can actually summarize it like this. So if you first look at the empirical findings on market structure and innovation, it seems quite inconclusive. So you have studies ranging from there's no correlation at all to studies that say there's a linear relationship, be it either positive or negative. And in more recent studies, it says that actually they are in a inverted U relationship. I will come back to that later. I will first start with the studies that find no correlation. So these studies are actually quite a bit older. So most of them are dated back to the 80s. Most notably, you have Scherer in 1965 that indicated that no systematic relationship between inventive output and variations in market powers exist. Mansfield follows this finding. However, then it already stops. Then newer research in the 80s takes a more nuanced approach. So for example, Loon in 1986 found that no significant correlation between concentration and product patterning exists, but he very well found a positive relationship between concentration and process patterning. So we can already see that people are starting to become more nuanced in their research, which is also, I think, a very important development. During the 80s, we also had other studies that basically showed that there is a positive linear relationship between concentration and innovation. So they're basically saying Schumpeter was right. However, these studies are rather rare, at least in the sense of that studies that state without any other conditions that there is a positive correlation between concentration and innovation are either very old or they actually want to have certain conditions met. For example, we have Kommelmeier in 1967 already, who suggested that entry barriers need much more consideration. Same with Angelmeier in 85, which basically said that we need lower barriers to imitation, only then this positive correlation can be in place. Interestingly, we have a study in 2017 that again unconditionally shows a linear positive relationship between market concentration and innovation. So it's not quite clear yet if that not exists, but the general consensus is actually that we probably rather have the opposite to Schumpeter's proposition, so that we actually have a negative relationship or linear relationship between concentration and innovation. At least in the 90s, these seem to be the consensus, where most studies actually, generalizing, most studies said that you need actually highly competitive markets to create correct incentives to innovate. Yes, so, but in more recent years, actually these two opposing ideas were sort of combined together to a certain degree. So Aguillon et al. In 2005, they came up with this, what I've called already before, the inverted U relationship between concentration and innovation. So basically what that means is if you have low concentration and you increase concentration, this is good for innovation. But at one point, you'll hit like a tipping point, and then if you increase concentration, it actually will be bad for innovation. So in that sense, it gives a very nuanced approach to how we should handle and how the correlation could be. Ever since Aghion et al. Came up with this, it actually got quite a lot of recognition by other research papers or by other empirical studies. So this seems to be, so what I would call this maybe to like summarize what the state of the research is right now, is that there might be a limited consensus that this U or inverted U curve exists, but it's not absolutely sure yet. And there's definitely more research needed. So if we look at, however, what we could do in the future. So I'm going to repeat what I think has already been said multiple times here. Empirical research has its limitations, of course, as we have to choose variables. And I agree with the fact that the selection of variables doesn't always necessarily need to mean we're looking at innovative output. So, for example, in most studies I looked at, innovation is often considered or simultaneously considered with spending on research and development. However, using that as a proxy, I find a bit misleading because you can also do research and development and no innovation comes from it. So not sure how good that is. On the other hand, when it comes to market structure, you also have to choose proxies, and which is equally difficult. So a lot of them go to market shares, but actually choosing market share may seem straightforward, but it can also be very misleading because it only offers actually a static snapshot of market structure, and it neglects spillover effects and potential competition or innovative output from new markets. So actually using market share as an index for a competitive landscape can be a bit misleading. Furthermore, many studies that I looked at, I would say the majority of the studies, tend to focus on how market concentration influences innovation, but does not actually, none of the studies, but only a minority of the studies considers that innovation could also influence market structure. So I personally think there should be much more research on that as well, especially because there could be a problem of reverse causality, because we just assume that it's market concentration that leads to innovation, even though it could be the other way around. And this was also actually the match with Schumpeter's theory of creative destruction, since this creative destruction then creates concentration in that sense. So yeah, I'm already done with my literature review. So just actually to summarize, there is no consensus, maybe a little bit consensus with the U curve, and there's still lots of possibilities to make more research on the topic.
All right, thanks very much. Indeed, then we will discuss how we can make sense of all of that. And as Alexandra and Philip will explain in just a minute, complexity theory and economics might be the answer to some of the questions in the space. And I'm especially reminded of the concept of increasing returns, right? So if you introduce an innovation that may actually lead to a certain market where you see oligopoly or monopoly, it might be that indeed innovation is leading the concentration on the market and not the opposite way around. Now, on that note, we're going to hear not from one, but two speakers now, Alexandra and Philip. They will tell us about the literature they identified when it comes to the relationship between innovation and competition, but more specifically, how innovation drives competition. Please note that we did not task them to identify the empirical evidence on the subject, because indeed, as Frederic mentioned, the impact effect, or this idea that innovation drives competition, is quite new in the literature, although, I mean, this has been here, you know, since maybe the 70s. You've seen a group of papers being published more intensively of those questions. But when it comes to the translation in empirical models, it seems that we have very little. So we ask them to identify the literature dealing with the subject, not necessarily from an empirical basis, because we thought this would be unfair to ask them to try to identify the single paper that may exist somewhere. So on that, Alexandra and Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The topic of the relationship between competition and innovation is a meeting point of many perspectives, many schools of thought, many approaches. Some of them were already named, and that's why, together with Alexandra, we decided for a division of labor in which I will shortly present the theoretical landscape we discovered through our research, and then Alexandra will come to you with some more empirical findings, case studies, and specific industries, specific economies where the influence of innovation and competition can be observed. And usually in the late literature, we can see the articles focused on the impact of the competition on the abilities on innovate. And in the same time, let me quote, innovation can have an impact on the dynamics and structure of markets, can drive competitors out of those markets, block entry of new competitors, or change the business models for those who want to stay and compete. Especially visible in the digital economy, where the development of technologies, emergence of an innovation-based economy leads to unprecedented level of dynamism. However, with this innovation comes also controversies caused by the big tech and the biggest companies, which seem to monopolize many of the important digital markets and influence the most important values of innovation. Our main finding is that in the literature, both some point of view that seem to criticize the modern system of regulation of the economy, and both defenders of the status quo refer rather to a static paradigm described by Frederic at the very beginning. The static paradigm of economic analysis is focused rather on the concept of equilibrium, of observing economy as a state, competition as a structure, not as a process where changes are the crucial part of increasing welfare and reaching the ends of the economy. And we've noticed that the same perspectives are taken on the both ends of this discussion. That's why we decided to follow perspective of dynamic competition, which recognizes competition as a process of rivalry, not for the short-term profits coming out of prices, but rather competition for future rents, in which different companies, heterogeneous entities, can use their dynamic capabilities to rivalize for future rents on digital markets. And in the complex economy, which is based on innovation dynamics created by digital technologies, innovation is the primary driver of change and of profits in this system. We believe that the interdisciplinary review of literature of technology management, evolutionary economics, behavioral theory of the firm, and deliver supporting arguments to dynamic competition approach, and can lead to the most important task of this perspective, which is turning its concept, its abstract tools, into some mechanism that could be used in practice of the competition law enforcement. And here I would like to pass the floor to Alexandra so she can speak about the specific industries and case studies showing some examples of using dynamic perspective approach as a tool to analyze innovation and its influence on competitive processes.
Thank you, Philip. So I will follow by addressing the subject of the practical impact of innovation on competition. So delving into the top-tier academic literature, the analysis reveals quite an intricate, multifaceted relationship between innovation and competition. And from reviewing over 450 academic articles published in top journals, ABS 3+, with keywords on using innovation and competition listed in Web of Science, the main finding indicates that while there is a broad understanding of this relationship, there is no clear consensus on how innovation actually influences competition. The complexity of this dynamic evolves continually and is shaped by diverse industries and changing market conditions. So diving deeper into this literature, basically the traditional literature often positions competition as a driver of innovation, as we heard before. However, recent studies are highlighting that innovation can drive competition. For instance, firms often innovate to escape market competition or to create new market areas where they can have an advantage. So looking at specific industries, the impact varies. And we found that in the US pharmaceutical industries, firms that focused on innovation were more profitable over time, while in Spanish manufacturing sectors, patents, which is basically a factor of innovation, were found to reduce competition. Further studies, for instance, on the killer acquisition in drug development, shows a direct strategy where big companies buy smaller innovative companies to reduce competition. And in the tech industries, innovation is seen as a major driver of competition. And turning our attention to the disruptive technologies like additive manufacturing, so 3D printing, and TiVo in television, we've observed a profound reshaping of competition. So these innovations not only introduce new market dynamics, but they also disrupt existing business models in neighboring industries. For example, the additive manufacturing, so the 3D printing, has revolutionized industries such as dental manufacturing by offering novel production methods. Similarly, TiVo's entrance into the television industry challenged traditional market hierarchies and compelled established firms to either innovate or risk falling behind. Furthermore, there is a recent trend in the literature that focuses on investigating ecosystem, particularly platform ecosystem, which indirectly explore the impact of innovation on competition. So in these ecosystems, the innovation often occurs in a collaborative yet competitive environment, especially in digital platforms. For instance, Intel balances the impact of innovation on competition by strategically entering the complementary markets and using organizational structures to encourage innovations among entrants. So Intel also becomes competitor with their own complementers. And in this way, Intel also avoids market domination of complementers and maintains a competitive ecosystem. So to conclude, while there's a general understanding of the relationship between innovation and competition, it's not a straightforward one. There are different industries that show different patterns, and the academic world is also exploring these complexities of this relationship. So innovation can be both a reaction to competition and the cause of it, especially in technology-driven sectors. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. So here's what I suggest. In the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to try to make sense of it all. Nicolas and I had access to the literature review, so I will start with you, Nicolas. It will be unfair to put Frederic on the spot right now and to try to dive in the subject after hearing the three presentations, but then I will go to you, Frederic, in case you want to add anything, as I'm sure or I hope this will be the case. But Nicolas, please, what are the takeaway from all we've heard?
Thank you, Thibaut, for asking me that question. Okay, so I'm going to try to distill a little bit the know-how that I gathered from that experiment. Okay, so what do we know for a start? I think we know from the literature that innovation dominates other forms of economic processes to bring about long-term prosperity and growth. I believe from my reading that there's widespread agreement about this, and academic works that try to describe innovation as a problem. There was a book recently, or a paper, I can't recall the title, something like "Innovation is Killing Us" or something like this, belong more to the genre of journalistic research or anecdotal evidence than to the world of science and empirical research. Okay, so I think that there is agreement in the literature on this, and we can park that idea and use it as a source of legitimacy for trying to improve and protect innovation through conscious policy. I think the second area of consensus in the literature, and that dates back to the 1980s, is that the process of innovation is endogenous, not exogenous. So the old idea that innovation could be considered as manna from heaven, falling on the economy as a natural force, is not something that is any longer accepted. Innovation is manufactured by the public and the private sector and requires organization. It is not a process that is completely mystical or metaphysical. And I think there's lots of work to do in trying to understand what are the endogenous drivers of innovation. And I think the economic literature is struggling a lot with this, because a lot of the organization required for innovation occurs within the firm through various processes, but also outside firms, in firms and within their environment through, for instance, ecosystems. And it's very hard to formalize these endogenous processes. I think the third point that the literature tends to point to, even though I think maybe the consensus is a little more fragile here, is that innovation is co-created by small and large firms. But it doesn't mean that small and large firms must coexist at every point in time to deliver innovation. In other words, the literature tends to show that small firms may be required to introduce drastic or radical innovation, but when we reach phases closer to commercialization, products introduction, and scaling, large firms have a comparative advantage. So this means that you need both types of firms to co-create innovation, but you don't need necessarily a coexistence of these firms. And this has an implication for competition policy, in which there is often an intuition that the large firm buying the small one, or the small firm exiting the market in favor of the big one, is a problem. It doesn't need to be a problem if we have the right sequencing approach to our model for innovation, production, and commercialization. All right, beyond this, we don't know much, I think, and that's a big challenge. I think what we see that there's very limited empirical regularity in the relationship between innovation and competition. And the problem is that we are in a world in which policymakers like to predict. So like empirical regularity that allows them to decide on the basis of very imperfect facts in a way that is expedient. I think what we learn from the various young scholars' interventions is that a lot of this is very case-specific, industry-specific, geography-specific, time-specific. Innovation processes cluster around certain geographies. Think about the Silicon Valley, for instance, around certain times. Think about the 2000s, or around certain legal regimes as well. And we need a better, I think, case-by-case understanding of this, which might tell us that agencies need really to invest in research and development to understand the case specificity here. Thibaut, that's all I can say. I mean, it's a bit, I hope it's not too trivial and generic, but that's my understanding of things.
I think some people may have joined today to hear finally about the theory of innovation, right? But as Frederic mentioned, such a thing does not exist. We'll get there, just to be clear, but maybe not today. Frederic, is there any thought you'd like to share? How can we make sense of it all? Because you are also facing the agencies, right, coming at you and say, well, as you mentioned, we are displeased by the theories that we have, and yet we feel that we have to take innovation into consideration. So how do we answer the mismatch between those two positions? And you're on mute. You are on mute, Frederic. Yeah.
I wanted to say two things. One of them is not really important, but it's a question of history, really. I think that I heard from Jennifer the fact that the idea of the inverted U curve came, I don't know, in the 80s or in the 90s, that it was a relatively recent development. I must say on a personal level that the person who taught me about the inverted U curve was Mike Shearer in 1972. Okay, so it is not a new idea. It's an idea which has been around for a long time and has not lost. I mean, we still don't know exactly how we explain this phenomenon, but this type of relationship has been around for a long time. The second thing I wanted to say was, I saw that there was a question which was addressed to me, which was to say, well, looking at the capacity of firms to innovate, that's very difficult. How do you do it? On a personal basis, I was giving a seminar on the same topic not very long ago, and I was faced with that question, and people told me, okay, where should we find enlightenment? And so I drew up a list of all the economists which I thought were contributing to this. And so there's David Thies, Sionciti, Pisano, Marshall van Alsten, Jacobides. This was in the context of digital, but that's not the point. Annabelle Gore, Carmelo Sinamo, Mariana Macri, and a few others. And when I finished the list, I realized that each and every one of them is an economist in a business school, looking at business economics, not looking at competition economics. And what they do that we don't know how to do, because we basically look at firms as being a black box, okay? So we see the result of decisions of firm, we like them or we don't like them, but what is the process that goes on to reach those decisions? We just assume that it's the will of people and that's all there is to it. Those people were business economists. They look at the interior. They look at what is in the black box. And in particular, among those economists, there are people who've done very detailed research, for example, in the automobile industry, to see what are the capacities which have been, how they were distributed among the firms, and why is it that a firm like Tesla, for example, innovated more than a firm like, I don't know, General Motors or Ford. So it seems to me that part of the answer is that there's a split in the profession between the competition economists used to looking at the firm as a black box, and what we need for innovation is to go inside that black box, but there are people who are doing this. And people, by the way, there is a literature in the business schools on trying to assess quality of innovation as opposed to innovation as we do it, which is just, as we said, a dimension that doesn't involve quality. So I think that this is, there's help that can come if one decides to join up those two strands of literature.
All right, thanks a lot. So let me share my 2 cents on that, because I took quite a few notes when reading the literature review. And some of those intuitions are, I guess, reinforced by what I've heard today. The first one, which funnily is one of the points that Nicola mentioned, is that I think it's fair to say at this stage that slogans, they don't work, or at least they work in a sense that they may attract attention on your work, right, as a catchphrase, but they do not describe reality. What the literature is showing is that we need to be nuanced, right, when it comes to the type of innovation, the type of markets, and maybe other conditions. And I will come back to that. That's my third point. Point number 2, maybe more personal. I see a disconnect between the growing literature when it comes to addressing all of those questions, right, and what the EU courts and to some extent the agencies are doing. And in fact, I am not here to blame the court and the agencies, because again, without a theory of innovation, you don't want to put the courts and the agencies in a position where they would say, well, I guess this will happen in the future, and that's the basis for my decision, right? None of us will be pleased by this kind of situation and decision-making process. But what I think I would like to see is, at least despite the lack of consensus, we see a consensus on certain questions being important, right? And you see that the economist and the economic profession is investing certain questions, such as the link between the firm size and innovation, or the link between market structure and innovation. No consensus, but the consensus is, again, that this is an important question that I would like to see addressed in some of the court's decisions and the agencies taking actions. And point number 3, when looking at the evidence and the literature that our young scholars kindly identified for us, what I realized is that the literature is mainly coming out of economic journals. Indeed, most, if not all of those scholars producing this kind of studies are, when it comes especially to the capabilities, management and or business economists. But what is quite striking, in my opinion, is that lawyers tend not to be involved in those studies, right? Sometimes you see that there are co-authors, and I am not here to argue that a lawyer on her or his own should conduct an empirical study, because that's not what we can do. But not to see them as being co-authors, I think is quite surprising. What I've done in the last couple of days is that I tried to identify articles quantifying the impact of a court's decision on the level of innovation, and or the impact of regulation on the level of innovation, right, in a specific area. And what you see is that this kind of work is done by economists and sometimes management scholars. It seems to me that lawyers can also have a role to play in better understanding, fine-tuning the analysis when it comes to what the law or the court decision is saying, you know, as opposed to another one. So this is why DCI is here. Luckily, many of the scholars that Frederic mentioned are affiliates within the DCI, and Nico and I and many others are lawyers, or I think we identify ourselves as lawyers. So that's the good news. I'm curious now if any of the young scholars would like to share anything on, you know, hearing from your peers, whether you see similarities in the trends that you have identified. If you think, you know, what surprised you when doing this kind of literature review, if anything at all? No surprise.
If I may. So yeah, I think what Jennifer said also about market concentration and innovation, I think it's very much similar to also the fact that I think also what you said right now, that we need more lawyers, because I think what the empirical studies do is try to come up with an objective relationship between firm size, market concentration, and innovation. And I feel that there are a lot of subjective factors. So as you said, that a lot of times, and in a lot of jurisdictions, it's the regulation which drives innovation in markets where they see that there is not scope for other players to enter. So I think that sometimes it's not just about competition and innovation, or innovation and competition, but also the fact that there are other factors at play. And sometimes it's just some uncertainty that you can't predict. So there are a lot of these factors which I feel is what also determines this relationship, which I thought was missing in these, or each factor is sort of analyzed, but the cumulative effect of these factors probably is not something that is seen in a lot of studies. And also the fact about, as I said, the quality of innovation rather than the quantity of innovation, that maybe not a theory of innovation, but maybe like we could have a scale of innovation, that what do we actually see as we thought of, as you said, that, you know, we look at R&D, but R&D is not specifically, R&D expenditure is not specifically innovation, or does not always turn out to be innovation. So how do we look at innovation? So we have these concepts of disruptive innovation, but what new product could actually classify to be called as innovation is what I think something that requires more research.
Yeah, and definitely a space where lawyers can help. Nico, I think you want to add something.
Yeah, thank you, Thibaut. So I think my personal take on this is aligned with what you said about asking ourselves the right questions, and sometimes hard questions that competition agencies do not really like to formulate explicitly, because they entail complicated answers which might not really go into the sense in which agencies like. So you can ask yourself, for instance, a very practical question when you think about merger control, for instance. So if you have a merger on the table between firm A and firm B, and the market or the industry has also firm C, D, E, and F, right? And you're interested in innovation. You're not just interested in competition. One very relevant question for the controlling authority consists in asking itself whether the combination between A and B is the best capability combination to produce innovation. There are a lot of cases in which you may think that the merger that is on the table is not the best capability combination to deliver the innovation that the industry is trying to achieve. So for instance, to be very concrete, and I'm just making this up here, a merger between Microsoft and OpenAI might not be the best capability combination to deliver extremely efficient generative AI. You could think maybe a merger between Amazon and OpenAI would be a better combination. I'm absolutely making this up here. The question that I want to then ask here is whether we have a process. We can create a process that would allow agencies to think in terms of capabilities combinations in merger control without entering the very dangerous domain of discretionary industrial policy. And this requires from lawyers and economists and business and management scholars to come up with objective frameworks by which we can audit, score, and rank capabilities, realistic capability combinations in the context of merger control. At the Dynamic Competition Initiative, this is one of our key research agenda. We want to work on trying to audit internal and external capabilities and provide definitions, right? Starting from the idea that a capability is knowledge, experience, or skill, right? This is the definition from Richardson, the economist, and from, I think, in the second half of the 20th century. So we really want to ask these questions and try to objectify the analysis to avoid the perils of old school restructuring of market by political decision. I think that's the way I think a research agenda can be developed hand in hand with competition agencies.
Yeah, so up next, we're going to talk about which spaces we think we should invest. Already what is quite striking is that something that Frederic, you, Nicolas, and actually all the young scholars mention is that if there is a lack of consensus on certain questions, it means that you can't, as an agency, say, well, I need to better understand the strength of the competitors, and for that I would just look at the size of the competitor, right? This will be too easy and not accurate. So then you will need to enter the black box of those competitors, and indeed there we need tools to do that. But it seems that just analyzing the targets and the acquirer may be too short-sighted. That leads me to the fourth point on our agenda today. And this here relates to the next steps. Maybe I'll start with you, Frederic, asking you, where do you feel, so it's more of a sentiment than an empirical study here, that agencies are willing to move? So when you discuss with them and when they tell you that they are not happy with the situation, it means already that they recognize that they are willing to listen to what experts have to say, which is good. But which space or spaces should we invest? Is it merger control, as we discussed already quite a bit, or do you think we should go and try to provide them with tools in another area of competition law?
I don't know. It's a pretty wide-ranging question. It seems to me that it is absolutely clear that competition authorities would love to have economists be able to operationalize what they think on the relationship between competition and innovation. so that they would have no problem. I mean, by now they're ready to tackle the issue of innovation. They do realize that this is absolutely necessary. They don't have the tools to do it. Certainly all the tools that are developed in merger analysis or static tools, I mean, they were very well, if you have a very well-defined relevant market, which is not moving, but not particularly adapted to a dynamic environment. Now, to be able to adapt them to a dynamic environment, you have to have some sense of what are the underlying relationships. So we have to get into the black box of innovation. And we are looking for help. And I didn't mean to say that the lawyers should not contribute to this, but we need to have people be able to come up with reasonably simple and transparent relationships that competition authorities can work on, which they don't have. So that's one thing. A second thing, which is related to one of the questions that I saw on the, but which is also relevant, we don't know what is, and because it is the same problem, we don't know what is a pro-competitive industrial policy. Now, industrial policy is very much linked to promoting innovation, okay? We don't understand fully, or not entirely, how industrial policy works. Hopefully we're going to do in a few months, because the OECD has taken this as one of the topics of future roundtable. What is a pro-competitive industrial policy? In other words, a policy which is designed to promote innovation while at the same time preserving or maximizing competition. And there, I think that there's a combination of procedures and a substantive analysis, which I talked about, which is the relationship with competition innovation. The combination of those two things should help us get a sense of how to move forward. So very hard for me. I mean, we have to get into the black box, as you said. We have to find the people who are willing to do it. You're absolutely right in the sense that lawyers often have a much keener sense of what goes on within the firm, how decisions are made. And this could help our understanding of the relationship between competition and innovation. And second, the relationship between competition and financial markets. By the way, the question was on state aid policy. State aid policy is state aid which is distributed without understanding what is going to help for innovation, what is not going to help for innovation. So we know from the start that when we say, okay, we have to have state aid for industrial policy purposes to develop both innovation in the digital sector and resilience of our economy, the first thing we do is we divide by the number of countries so that each one will have its allocated share, which is completely doesn't make sense from a competition point of view or from an effectiveness point of view. Okay, so I think that we need to have a wider discussion that goes into the black box and relate at the macroeconomic level competition policy and other pro-innovation policies.
Yes, thank you very much. Asking questions that are nearly impossible to answer is kind of my specialty. I see that Bo is in the room and he would love to say that, so I'm saying that for you, Bo. Let me ask then Nicolas kind of the same impossible question. What are the next steps? So, you know, what should we investigate first? Knowing that, of course, we work together in the DCI, so I could answer the question, but it's much funnier for me to hear you on the subject. So please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Thibault. I'm just going to offer a few remarks so you can then, double down or add to this. I think this concept of capabilities is very important. And this will require a change of mindset, as Fred mentioned before. We've been discussing a lot about incentives, this sort of mechanical idea about how antitrust decisions affect behavior. we may be more interested in trying to understand the context of market and the business organization and the capabilities in the business organization, focusing less on conduct and strategic price harms, right? So in other words, what you may want to do as an antitrust agency is to maintain a population of firms with appropriate capabilities and recalibrate your concerns towards capabilities more than the actual business conduct of the organizations, right? If you have the right population of firms with the appropriate combinations that are innovation inducing, this may be good enough, rather than trying to conjecture what's going to happen in terms of marketplace behavior in the next 2 years, right? And you know, there's a false certainty about this. I think today the antitrust economics literature gives us a lot of false certainty about business conduct, and we see in market that predictions and conjectures about business conduct do not really materialize. And so this confidence that we have that we can predict business conduct, I think it's falsely appealing. And the disconfidence that we have about trying to gauge whether business organizations embed enough capability to innovate, this disconfidence towards that diagnosis is not warranted, because indeed we have lots of good scholarship that tell us that, you know, to organize innovation, you need certain capabilities, and they can be measured and estimated. There's a very good paper from Peter Merman and a colleague, I can't recall his or her first name, Vogt, and they have developed a framework to estimate innovation capabilities in the electrical vehicle, in the automotive electrical vehicle sector.
Yeah.
And they have a list of 14, I think, capabilities, right? That kind of work is what lawyers, economists, and business and management scholars should be doing, tailored to the need of a process of antitrust examination and merger review that asks itself the right questions. And I think this is what we need to do. And you know, it's for me, it's just like complete priority work. We need to get out of this incentives business behavior prediction model. I know, Thibault, maybe you want to add to this.
Yeah, so I see that we have 30 minutes left, and somehow, surprisingly, we kind of assumed that because we are on Zoom right now, we have to go to the end of the hour, right? So just so you know, we're going to go through the Q&A in just a minute, and we'll see if we are together for 30 more minutes. But for now, I'll just take a minute and say that, you know, despite the lack of consensus, what I see is that courts and to some degree agencies are not always considering or asking the same question and or considering the same parameters or variables in very similar cases. And this is where you could say, well, that you could do, right? So it's unfair as a remark for the courts, because of course they are bound by the principle of party disposition, right? Meaning that if the parties are not making a point, the court cannot say, well, you forgot to make that point, which would have been a good point. Therefore, I'm going to address the point nonetheless. But yet you see that, well, when it comes to the distinction we may want to make between the incentive effects and the impact effect, meaning competition drives innovation and or innovation drives competition, you will assume that for certain digital markets, you will find consistency. And this is not what, looking at the EU Court of Justice, I find, which I suppose is because the agencies, when bringing the case, knowing that they can actually choose, you know, which theory of harm they would choose, they may not have considered the same variables in the same cases. So when it comes to having more and having a more complete theory, I would say this is half of the discussion we may want to have, right? About how to integrate dynamic capabilities, and more and better understand the legal environments. And we'll go to the Q&A in just a minute, but I think there is a very good questions, you know, when it comes to the how close you are to the capital markets. This is half of what we may want, a complete theory of innovation. The other half might be to have a more coherent theory of innovation. On that, I see that Frederic, you want to say something, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on what Nicolas just said, to say two things. One of them is I completely agree that the book, and I can't remember the co-author paper, is one of the most interesting papers that I've read that could develop a methodology that competition authority could use, so that this work is very important. Now, but I wanted to disagree with Nicolas on one point. You started your intervention by saying, well, maybe what we want to do is just to make sure that there are enough firms that have the capacity to develop innovation, rather than going into too much detail about which innovation, because all this becomes very speculative. But there's a danger there. In other words, if you block a merger by saying, well, I want those firms to remain independent because both of them would have the capacity to invest tomorrow and possibly to lead to efficiency. What you're doing is that you're assuming that they would not use their technologies in a complementary way to develop innovations today, or you're willing to pay that price, the lack of innovation today, in order to protect competition tomorrow. Now, competition authorities have usually been faced with exactly the opposite, an anti-competitive practice or an anti-competitive transaction today, and the firms arguing that tomorrow there are going to be efficiencies. In what you said, we're faced with the opposite, okay? The competition will come tomorrow if the possible lack of efficiency or inefficiency or not as great an efficiency materializes today because we're preventing the merger in order to keep the capacities. But then the question is, competition authorities have always discounted what's going to happen in the future as being speculative and having not important. So if we apply this reasoning to your proposal, the proposal of having enough competition on innovation tomorrow by restricting mergers between firms that have the capacity to innovate today, either the competition authorities will have to be a bit schizophrenic and to say, well, in that case, if we're talking about competition tomorrow, then I don't discount it as being speculative. But that's not going to square very well with the traditional approach to what is going to happen in the future. Or we are going to try to have to find a way to put together the traditional resistance to what's going to happen tomorrow, and the fact that in the example that you gave, it may be that you're giving up efficiencies today for an uncertain future on competition. So I think that competition authorities will have a difficult time doing that. That's what I'm saying.
All right, Nico.
Yeah, so I absolutely understand the concern, and I actually know this fairly well, to the extent that we've been, Fred, we've been discussing this time and time again, the discount factor of competition agencies when they look at the future, and their maybe institutional design leading them to discount the future gains from innovation by a larger proportion than the present gains from competition. But one thing that I want to say about this is that the discount factor of competition agencies should be based on empirical evaluations of what's going on in markets. So if you have a sector of the economy in which capital markets work very well, they're very deep, financing of innovation flows, there's lots of M&A activity providing enormous scope for funding of risky projects. If you have legal institutions in place that allow firms that fail to repurpose very quickly, bankruptcy regime, if you have national subsidy programs and proximity to ecosystems of innovation, then maybe your discount rate need not be as high as it has traditionally been. And that's, calls our attention to one other hard question. And that is something that I don't think agencies do today, but maybe should think about doing, which is to look at industry sectors in the economy with a more empirical eye and not treat them horizontally as equal and applies the same discount factor. In certain industry segments, the agencies could have a lower discount factor about the gains from future innovation than in other industry segments. So if you say, for instance, let's take the digital economy and let's take the cement market, right? You may not be equally confident about the prospect of future innovation in cements than in the digital economy, right? And I think this correction of the discount factor, I believe it should be based on an empirical and objective assessment of the institutional, financial, and labor market characteristics of the industry.
Like, anything you want to add, knowing this will be the last word? No, okay. Let me add to the discussion then, because the fight is always interesting. No, what I wanted to say is that something we've been also trying to address in trying to take the future into consideration, or the time factor in the DCI. And if you go to our website, dynamiccompetition.com, you will find some of those studies, is that what you may also do is address variables that you can observe today that may actually shape the future. So let me be more specific. If we look at the markets with increasing returns, and I would argue that the one for the AI foundation models is one of increasing returns, right? What you may want to ask is, what is the source of those returns? So how do you benefit from the snowball effect? And the point I can make is that when it comes to AI foundation models, the very source of your ability to benefit from those increasing returns are access to users. If you don't have that, you have nothing. You can have all the big data, the unique data, the computing power you won't be able to survive. So if you are, as an agency, to target practices implemented by one company to deprive competitors from getting a fair access to users, you are doing today something that will actually help innovation in the future, right? So considering innovation doesn't always have to be trying to best guess what might be the market in a long distant future. It might also be to do something today so that you actually anticipate that. Another paper we published is one by Nico and David Thies, looking at a dynamic capabilities checklist, right, of things you may want to ask companies to provide you with as an agency today, again, not looking at the future, today, so that you better understand what is the strategy of the company. Another paper is one that you'll find on the website co-authored by Bo Nicola on the rents. So in any case, putting that aside, we have 15 minutes left and 4 questions to address. So I'll go in the order by which we received those questions. The first one, Frederic, you answered half of the question regarding state aid, and another half was kind of addressed, but just to be sure that we are pleasing that person who asked the question. In substance, the question relates to access to the capital markets. And if there are indeed lack of studies showing empirical evidence and close relationship between the market structure, the size of the company, and innovation, it might be that there are studies to be found when it comes to access to the capital markets. And it might be the reason why in Europe we don't have any of the big tech companies or the top 10 unicorns, as mentioned in the chat. So I'm not sure the question is addressed to any specific panelists, but if any one of you wants to address that, please go ahead.
I think it's a very good argument. I mean, at least in the case of France, one of the major differences between France and the US is the fact that medicine is entirely socialized, or nearly entirely socialized in France. Whereas in the US, it's all in private insurance company funds, which means that access to capital in the US, I mean, there's an enormous amount of capital that's trying to invest itself, and which is ready to be taken up by firms when they have dynamic innovation. So when Nicolas was saying earlier, if we assume that we have a deep financial market, a lot of the problems that we're talking about would be different, because there would be much more innovation, it would be much more widespread, and small, in particular, firms would have a better access to capital market. So I think that this is an area which is very clear, and I'm always struck by the fact that competition authorities in their advocacy function have never focused on this, and I think that they should, because it's a factor that would increase both innovation and competition.
All right, thanks a lot. Question number 2 from Simon is more of an observation, maybe not calling for any specific response. And the point he's making is that it might be, and I quote here, very difficult to innovate if indeed you are in a market where it's hard for a firm to make returns above the cost of the capital, right? And he's making a point that if you are a billionaire, then you may have a temptation to disrupt the market, but depending on the condition, you may not be incentivized to do so. So again, going back to the idea of capital, which triggers already the need to conduct empirical literature review on that relationship with innovation, would any one of you like to address that point any further? Not necessarily. Yeah. No,
I mean, I could take, because I know what he's talking about, because I'm from India. So I think the example that Simon gives, so it was not because of the ability to invest or to be able to have returns. What Mukesh Ambani, or the billionaire, is basically the richest person in India, and what he did was basically give in the telecom sector, give SIMs for free and not charge for anything. So consumers could basically use as much data as they wanted, as much, could do anything without having to pay anything. So the market was actually competitive before as well, because there were big players like Vodafone, and after that the regulator intervened and said that you have to charge something, and so we now have like an oligopolistic telecom market in India, which is very competitive. So I think, to answer Simon's question, which is that it could be difficult to innovate where firms do not make returns, that telecom market is not specifically, it was not because the firms did not have incentive to innovate. It was basically that there was this disruptor, again, sort of what we see in digital markets, who wanted to sort of have a market which was completely dominant, in which this person was completely dominant. So but again, I think what that did was make the market of a lot more competitive than what it was. So I think that's what we sort of look at, and what we are trying to look at, which is that whether firm size and market concentration can have innovation. And of course, there are certain industries where we do have that kind of innovation. And yeah, so that's basically how these market dynamics can sort of play out.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much. Next question from Fernando, pointed at Nicolas. So the point is making, or at least the question is that the study of the conditions in which the firm may evolve, especially when it comes to the legal regime, and especially when it comes to bankruptcy and other financial conditions, may indeed explain a lot of the innovation and dynamic competition that we see in the space. So the question is, what about the restricted macroeconomic conditions for financing innovation? Do you think those are playing a role? And yeah, could you elaborate a little bit on that? Do you know of any literature on the subject? Those are 3 questions combined in one.
Thank you. It's a good question. So Anu Bradford, she's a professor at Columbia Law School. She came last week to the EUI to present a paper called The False Choice Between Regulation and Innovation. And it's a very US centric paper when you think about it. It's a lot focused on the EU, but it talks a lot about this idea that exists in the US that you have so much innovation in the US because you have very limited regulation. And Europeans do not have a lot of innovation because there's too much regulation. GDPR, the Data Act, Data Governance Act, the AI Act, and this and that. And so Anu, in her paper, she tries to debunk the thing and say, actually, it's not true. There's no trade-off. In fact, if Europe has so little innovation, it's mostly due to the absence of a single market, you know, with deeper capital markets and more flexible bankruptcy regime, and also a culture of, you know, failing is good, failing is learning in the US versus failing is failure in the EU. So the paper is on this. Now, there's one thing though that so it's a good start to, it's a good paper because it makes you think a lot about, you know, what is really the issue behind the problem that we in Europe feel we have, and it's documented that we're lagging behind. It's been like for 20, 30 years like this. In 1966, Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber wrote a book called The American Challenge. If you read it today, you'd be struck by the modern relevance of the book for today. I think what is interesting here, Thibaut, if you allow me just you know, two more statements here, is we need to understand that even if regulation doesn't really undermine innovation at the abstract level, in a context like the European context, in which we have 27 member states with different languages, different labor markets, different bankruptcy regime, which is much more fragmented, the marginal costs of poorly designed regulation might be higher than in a system like the US, which is much more homogeneous, at least in terms of language and maybe culture and higher education institutions. And so this is the difference probably, you know, between Europe and the US, which is, it's not that there's a bad relation, there's a trade-off between regulation and innovation, but the costs of regulation might be marginally higher in Europe compared to the US. The second point that I want to make here is the following. So beyond this idea that the cost of regulation on innovation are context dependent, right? They depend on where you actually roll out this regulation. The second point is that the risk of designing poorly formulated legislation might be higher in places in which you don't have a lot of innovation going on. In other words, the technological literacy of public policy experts might be higher when you are proximate to clusters of innovation, because you have more knowledge transfer between the policy structure and the innovation ecosystems, right? And Europe, unfortunately, doesn't have as large innovation ecosystems as the United States. And so these are structural disadvantages that we do not want to curtail further by adding layers of regulation that might be more costly for us than for the US. So these are conjectures, but I think they need to be studied very seriously.
Yeah, and you know, on that, let me add just a couple of words, which is another EU challenge that they maybe don't have in the US. If we fear fragmentation, because indeed, imagine dealing with 27 different legal regimes, right? It sounds like a nightmare. The obvious answer is to consolidate, right? Or to say we're going to provide legal certainty. But then it's not the end of it, right? Because the certainty to failure, or the certainty that you will kill innovation, is not the kind of certainty that we want, or consolidation that we want. And to some degree, those are the dynamics that you see in the AI Act, right? It says it wants to prevent the situation in which the 27 member states will come up with different AI regulation, which will be the end of it in Europe. But if it puts a burden on especially small companies to come up, I always have in mind Article 11 that says you have to come up with the technical documentations for your AI system that explains how your system also complies with EU fundamental rights, which means that at the very least, you need 2 employees to work on those, right? Technical expert and a lawyer with good understanding of EU fundamental rights. And it might be that you need way more than that, which for a startup of 4 employees is pretty much the end of the startup, right? So that's another challenge that we have in Europe. Good consolidation, yes, but consolidation at all costs may be sometimes endangering what we have here and the ecosystem. I believe you want to add another point. Keep in mind that we have 2 more questions to address.
Yeah, just one point. I think, the point that I was trying to drive here is, I think it's urgent that Europe invests in its single market. The problem is that the incentive structure and the political layer of the European Union is not supportive of that kind of work, and it's more supportive of new stuff like the AI Act or the Data Act or slapping big fines and this and that. There's no political reward to saying we are going to harmonize bankruptcy laws in Europe. Anu Bradford made this point loud and clear last week at the EUI.
Let me ask the next question to you, Frederic, unless you don't want to answer the question, but I have a sense that you may have something to say here. The question is from Anouk, and I believe that Philippe will also like to say a word about it. And in substance, she's asking if you read the Microsoft Activision Blizzard merger decision as one recognizing that innovation is driving competition, because indeed it seems that the theory of harm is that eventually all the market will be blurred. And so it seems to go in this direction. Is it your reading also of the decision?
Yes, I think my answer would be yes. I mean, that's one part of it, an important part of it. And this is part of what I was saying, the fact that there are more and more mergers of that type now, where this kind of issue is raised. If you think about, I don't know, Adobe Figma, if you think about Microsoft Activision, okay, and that's why competition authorities have to face the issue. I said that the good news was the fact that they were comfortable with the idea of trying to take a more dynamic approach to competition than sticking to the incentive dimension. Whether they do a good job of taking on board innovation as a driver of competition is the question that we've been discussing, because we don't have all the analytical tools. But I would say that this decision is one of a number. I mean, personally, I would start with the Dow DuPont decision and said ever since then, we've had quite a bit of those decisions. And also, if you look at the new merger guidelines in the US, I mean, you see that there's an integration of the dynamic perspective as well in the guidelines. So it's not only in Europe.
Yeah, so we come back to, at least it's asking the right questions, and then we may disagree with the outcome of those decisions, right? But it's not here the goal of the discussion. Philippe, I think you want to add something when it comes to this question.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think that decision is important because even if it doesn't define the relationship between the innovation and competition, it still recognizes innovation as the crucial element of competition understood as a process, because we often see competition understood as an end in itself, missing the crucial role of innovation in creating consumer welfare. And that's why I'm afraid that decisions following the limited toolkit delivered to competition agencies or courts from approaches, economic schools which still rely on static paradigm may lead to important and big welfare losses in the future. That's why I think that competition law, competition doctrine should follow alternative schools and look at more competition between approaches, delivering us our toolkit. I think, for example, that the complexity economics, which recognize the endogenous character of innovation, which finds in itself place for increasing returns, feedback loops, and historical lock-in resulting from random events, may help creating some tests and predictors, improving the enforcement of competition law, and operationalizing idea that innovation influences competition at least as much as competition influences innovation.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Philip. All right, very last question. Nicola, you knew I had to be unfair at some point, so here I am. I'm going to ask you the last question, knowing that you have only 1 minute to answer the question, and because there is kind of a bias in the question, I'm going to ask you to end on a positive note, right? So the question is whether or not it's a good idea in the GMA to prohibit practices that, according to the economic literature, may sometimes help generating innovation. So it sounds like the answer Emil wants you to give is negative. We'll take as a given that this is the case or not. But again, I'm asking you to finish and to conclude on a positive note here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Thibaut. Again, you do it every time.
Every time.
Every time.
And I'll do it every single time.
And you will do it again. It's a repeated game. And there's no finite horizon. I should be prepared. I have a very simple answer to your question, Thibaut. As I said before, failure is learning. And if the DMA fails by prohibiting good conduct, we will learn a lot about what is good policy. This is the uplifting way to close this conversation and answer your question.
All right. Yeah. I'm also reminded of what Bill Kovaci sometimes tells me, that at least it's good for us, right? It means we have conferences to organize, places where to travel to give talks, and books to write. In any case, on that good note and indeed positive message, I would like to thank you all very much, young scholars, Frederic, Nicolas, for joining this workshop. Thank you so very much to all of you asking questions. The workshop is being recorded. It will be put on our YouTube channel. The best way for you to get it is to go on dynamiccompetition.com and subscribe to the newsletter. And on that, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.